I'm so excited to show you how to make this adorable puff tote bag. I've always admired these bags. They're stylish, practical, and oh so trendy, but it never crossed my mind to make one myself until now. This pattern is everything I love about quilting. It's the perfect way to use up scraps, show off your favorite prints with some fussy cutting, and play with some fun ombre layouts. Plus, it's lightweight, beautiful, and just as functional as it is fashionable. Whether you're heading to the farmer's market or a weekend getaway, this tote is your new go-to bag. This video will be a quick overview of the visual steps for making the tote, so don't forget to download the full pattern with every step written out for free. I'll post a link to that in the comments below. Before we dive into making the puffy outer panel, let's talk about what you'll need. For each side of the bag, you'll need 25 squares cut to 3.5 inches by 3.5 inches, and that's 50 squares altogether. These will be laid out in a 5x5 grid to create one side of the tote. You will also need the same number of backing squares, which are just 3 by 3 inches. The outer squares are going to be sewn to the backing squares even though they are 1/2 inch larger so that we can make these adorable pleats that give way to our little puff balls. In this photo, you can see my squares laid out for one side of the panel, and I've already sewn the backing squares to the back of them, so you can't really see them right now. The backing squares will be hidden inside the bag, making it perfect to use up your scraps. And just a quick tip, if your outer fabric is light colored, stick to light colored scraps for the backing too, in order to prevent them from showing through. Alright, let's get to sewing. Take one of your backing squares and lay it right side down, and then take one of your outer facing larger squares and place it on top of that backing square right side facing up, and align the top right corner of the fabric squares. And using a slightly less than 1/4 inch seam allowance, sew just 2 to 3 stitches down from the top corner, then stop with the needle down. This will help anchor the fabric as you align the bottom right corners. Next, you're going to want to pinch the extra fabric of the outside facing square to create a pleat down the middle of the edge. Hold it in place as you sew the rest of the edge with that same slightly less than 1/4 inch seam allowance. And no worries about here, later we will sew over this again with an actual 1/4 seam allowance, and later it will hide these seams. And we're just going to repeat this process on 2 more sides, leaving one edge open for stuffing later. Once you've sewn 3 sides, you've created your first puff pocket. So repeat these steps for all 25 squares for both sides of the tote bag. After you make all of your puff pockets, you're going to assemble them into rows. Take 5 pockets and just sew them together with a true 1/4 inch seam allowance, and this will hide the previous seams we just sewed. Repeat this to create 5 rows total for each side of the tote bag. And once your rows are sewn, it's time to add the puff. Take a small handful of stuffing and place it into each pocket. Be careful not to overstuff. You want enough to give the pocket volume, but not so much that it pushes against the open edge, making it difficult to sew the edge closed. And here I am sewing these rows together. I am going to stuff them as I sew at the machine so that you get an idea of how much stuffing I put into each pocket. And I also want to show you that the seams are going the same direction in each row, and each row goes in opposite directions so that later when you sew the rows together, you will nest the seams. So I would say like it was a nice handful. It fits in there and it gives good volume, but there's still like a lot of room to pinch, and it's like really easy to sew the pocket closed. And this will avoid making the tote bag very heavy, and it will still give it that volume that we love. So going down the row, we're just going to close the top pocket opening and make sure that the seam is running in the same direction that we designated for that row. The technique for closing the top will be the same we've used on all the other edges. Go a few stitches and make that pleat, and just double check the direction of that seam, and just go down the row closing up, making that pleat also with slightly less than 1/4 inch seam. Just finish the row this way, and then we're going to sew the rows together with an actual 1/4 inch seam. By the way, if you want to know which puff I used for this pattern, I love it. It's super soft and super light and airy. I have it linked in the pattern, so don't forget to sign up to get the free pattern, and you'll get every single step instruction with photos and a link to the same exact puff I used to make this tote bag. Alright, here are the rows that I've created. Everything's closed with a less than a 1/4 inch seam, and I just want to show you that in each row, the seams that I created are going in the same direction. So the bottom row goes in one direction, and then the row above it's going to go in the opposite direction, so that when I place them right sides together, I'm going to make sure that those seams are nested and that those seams don't get twisted. And when I sew them together, I will sew them with a 1/4 inch seam, and that'll hide the less than 1/4 inch seam that I just sewed with, just to close up the puffs. So this is what it looks like as a panel, the front and the back. You don't see the seams anymore. They are all hidden from using that less than 1/4 inch seam, and those corners match up pretty well because those seams are nested. Notice that if you pick a row, that one's going to the right direction, and here's left, right, left. So I did nest those seams to make really nice corners, and I'm liking how this is turning out. Next up are the handles. You're going to need to cut 2 strips of fabric to 4 inches by 26 inches and 2 strips of batting that are 3 inches by 26 inches. Center the batting on the wrong side of the fabric and fold the edges over. There should be about 1/2 inch overage on both of the long sides, and then press. Then fold the handle in half lengthwise and press that again. Sew an 1/8 of an inch seam along both long edges to secure those edges and so that there's no raw edges sticking out. Attach the handles to the top of each panel, placing them 2.5 inches from each side. Sew them in place with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. One thing I do to help make sure that my handles don't end up twisted is I hold in my hands like this, and I set it so that I make sure that the same side of the handle is against the outer tote bag opening. So 2.5 inches actually is going to land in that center square area on the edge. So just count 1 square in, and along that edge will be the 2.5 inches, and great for placement for the handles. Clip it in place and sew a 1/4 inch seam along the top. Same thing again to the other side. Now that the 2 outer panels have their handles on, it's time to make an outer shell of a bag, and in order to do that, I'm going to place them right sides together and make kind of an inside out bag. So I'm going to line up the handles and make sure the handles are facing down, and I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam along 3 of the edges. So the 2 on the side and 1 on the bottom. Do not sew along the top. You will close up your bag, and you're essentially sewing up your bag inside out. Now here's how I made the inner lining. I took 2 12.5 inch squares of lining fabric and I placed them right sides together, and then I sewed along 3 edges with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, essentially leaving an 8 inch gap along the bottom. Along those opening of the edges of the stitches, I did a back stitch just to make it secure. So essentially there's an opening in the bottom here, and that'll be used in the last step to help turn the bag right side out. And then there's an opening all along the top of the lining. So go ahead and sew your 2 linings together on the side and just a little bit in on the bottom. Now it's time to put everything together. I'm going to take the 2 outer puff panels, and I already sewed it inside out with a 1/4 inch seam all along the 3 edges. I did it twice, and I did it again with a zigzag seam just to make sure it's really secure. And right now I'm going to turn it right side out for the last step. And then I'm going to take the inner lining bag that I just showed you, and I'm going to put the outer bag inside of the lining bag. The lining should still be inside out, and essentially the right sides of all fabrics will be facing each other. Also make sure to tuck the handles in so that they are between both of the layers. Next step is to align the top edges of both the inner lining and the outer panels with clips, and I like to start at the sides on both sides. So I clip on the side and I clip on the other side, and then I just line up everything in between. And once everything is lined up together, sew a 1/4 inch seam along the top edge to connect the inner lining with the outer panel. This is what it will look like with the 1/4 inch seam along the top. And here's a peek inside the bag. These are the fabrics that you will no longer see anymore. So say goodbye to them. And here's that opening that you left in the inner lining. You're essentially going to pull the entire bag out of this opening as your last step. And really the only thing you need to do after this is to sew that opening shut. If you would like to, you can do a top stitch along the top of the bag. And I just really hope you enjoy making this bag as much as I do. If you love this project, I'd love for you to visit my website for more inspiring patterns, and don't forget to share your makes with me on social media. Again, this pattern is free. Please enjoy making it, and yeah, come back for more. Happy sewing!